Justin Owen's begun the chat even. Well done, Justin. Okay, we're going to start, and I could just briefly put, can everybody see Hope in a Time of Apocalypse? Can you see it, Fiona?
No.
We can see you now, Peter.
Okay.
That's quite good.
And we've got, well, let me just very
I could see it before, but I can't see it now.
Yeah.
No.
Because I needed to share it and I didn't. But I'll just quickly share that screen again. So now you can see it, okay?
Yep.
So welcome to this. It is a part of a series which we termed Hope in a Time of Apocalypse, and I gave the first one and everything collapsed around us as we realised that we couldn't keep meeting like this. So we've taken a little while, but we are now meeting like this virtually, and it's become a daily event for me and for lots of people, that we can still keep in touch and have lots of interesting information. In fact, it's been quite challenging for me this period. But this was a series of reflections that came out of the St Paul's community in Fremantle, and we did have people who we will line up for continuing series here, people like Peter Dowding and Brad Pettit and Gemma Green and Josh Byrne, Julian Illich, who's an inventor in Fremantle. So a lot of people who will line up at various points to talk about the future. But we're very, very happy to have Fiona as our first speaker in this. Let me begin by just welcoming everybody the way we do in the church on Sunday mornings, and now virtually, with the welcome to country. We acknowledge the beauty and sacredness of this land, its ongoing formation from the beginnings of time, the traditional Whadjuk Noongar custodians, and all life and creation that has gone before us, of which we are a living part. I really like that one. So I'm going to hand over to Fiona. Before I do, just the way it'll work, she will speak for 30 minutes or so based on a book that she's contributing to about the future, and we will have questions after that. And the best way to do that is to put your question up on chat. You'll see that something down the bottom that you can quickly go to, and it will be available to you to write something there, and I will transfer that question. If it's a small enough group, remains small enough, we should be able to get immediate questions from people as well. But when the person whose question we're doing is there, we'll turn you on, and you can be seen and talk about it as well. So we do want to have some good interaction, and Fiona's been very helpful to give us this time today. She's in Melbourne looking after grandchildren and enjoying the cold weather over there. But Fiona is a Perth person and now a Fremantle person who is extremely well known as an epidemiologist. Set up the Telethon Kids Institute in 1989, which is a long time ago now. It's been a brilliant success. She has got a hospital named after her. She has 10 honorary doctorates. Just have a look at Wikipedia sometime. And continues to work as a professorial fellow at UWA. So she's going to reflect on the pandemic and the global economic depression that we are entering, and where do we go from here. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Peter. I hope everyone can hear me. It's actually, you're doing me a service, because we're Dr. Kate Lysett and I are writing an essay for a book that MUP are going to publish about a reconstruction post the pandemic. And so what I'm going to do is actually read from the chapter. I hope that's not going to be too boring for you, but it means that I'll get through everything in probably the 30 minutes. If I waffled on, I'd probably take longer. So yes, so it's about really reconstructing a civic society that promotes health and well-being, particularly for our younger citizens, which of course is dear to my heart. And can we take lessons from before the coronavirus and during the coronavirus pandemic to take us forward into a post-coronavirus uplit pastures of you know, equality and sustainability. So I think as a nation, Australia has to decide, do we snap back to the way things were before coronavirus, or do we learn from our reflections on the dramatic changes that occurred during coronavirus to become a more equitable and sustainable Australia after coronavirus? The decisions made over the coming months have the potential to change our unfair, profit-dominated environments. These before coronavirus environments were responsible for many of our wicked problems that have grave consequences for our youngest generations, our younger citizens and future generations who proportionally have been more negatively affected by the pandemic and will feel the consequences for decades to come. So before coronavirus, our health and welfare systems increasingly focused on profits rather than children's and families' needs. We reflect that this has not served us well in the international stakes of successful countries. I'll come back to that later. And to quote Rebecca Solnit this year, during such catastrophes, we see with new clarity the systems, political, economic, social, ecological, in which we are immersed as they change around us. We see what's strong, what's weak, what's corrupt, what matters and what doesn't. It's a great writer. We have a golden opportunity to remove these systems and services which are weak and corrupt and which do not properly serve the health and well-being of all of our citizens. With this reflection, we can make systemic changes towards a more equitable and sustainable civil society. Could you put the figure up for me, Peter, which is an old diagram that I did with Margot Pryor and Sue Richardson in a book that we wrote. And it's a diagram of a child in the middle of its family, community and school. And you can see that on your left-hand side, there's a whole lot of factors which make for a civil society, such as equality and diversity, trust and care, collective good. And on the other side, an uncivil society, where in fact those opposites are. So instead of collective good, you prioritise those very few people and the wealthy. And so you have things like preventions more than cures, protected environments instead of degraded, safe places for all, except for on the other side, safe places for the few, effective use of helpful technologies, excessive use of damaging technologies, and so on. So I think you might sort of like to think about what Australia before COVID looked like. And I think it looked more like the uncivil society on that right-hand side. And what happens is if we can actually think of these factors in our society, the social, the workplace, the political, the cultural and economic, things which either enable or disable a child and its family to be developmentally healthy. And that's what this slide is trying, or this figure is trying to portray. Thanks, Peter, for that. So before coronavirus, okay, our economy was internationally lauded as having a remarkable run with 3 decades of sustained economic growth. However, an excessive focus on GDP as the singular measure of societal progress has been detrimental to health and well-being. Our universal healthcare system was judged one of the best in the world, providing essential services to Australians, to all Australians. For example, most Australians with serious illnesses like children with cancers or diabetes or developmental disorders have access to world-class services. We have the lowest rates of smoking internationally, and the rates of serious alcohol drinking in teenagers were falling. Whilst introduced too late, our international paid parental leave of 18 weeks was a huge strength, both to enhance parenting and to make a statement about valuing children and those who care for them. Our system of family and unemployment benefits were also strong, particularly compared to countries like the US. However, our short-term focus on growing the economy, jobs and profits at the cost of our civic values and at the cost of the health and well-being of children and future generations. The wave of privatisation which characterised the neoliberal age have negatively affected health and welfare services, many of which were driven by profit rather than to serve all people across the nation. Inequalities in access to health and welfare services increased, the most obvious being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but also for rural populations and those from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Poor health outcomes, such as serious mental health problems, increased with the resulting appalling suicide rates, for example. This is going to be controversial now. The fee-for-service model of medical care serves the medical profession well, but has tended to increase the costs of care, much of which may not be necessary and some not actually safe. I don't know if you saw the 7:30 report on back pain, but that's just one example. And there's things like joint surgery, which is shown to be ineffective, and we have 3 times the rate of caesarean sections that we actually probably need. Of particular note to me is the domination of pathology services nationally by a small number of large corporates whose main aim is to make profits rather than serve their populations. Fee-for-service also drives an oversupply of specialists in cities and a significant lack of access to necessary services outside the metro area. So post-World War II, we had capitalism with a sort of social democratic face, much like today's Scandinavia, which resulted in many countries establishing excellent public health services in public health and welfare services. This changed dramatically following Thatcher and Reagan's influences in the late 1980s. With wealth creation and individual greed became the new capitalism, with the excessive focus on consumption, profits and shareholders being served more than ordinary people. This style of capitalism spread across the world and across all services. Consequently, our economic wealth has disproportionately increased at the top, enhancing inequities and eroding the quintessential Australian fair go. The neoliberal agenda successfully constructed a narrative portraying the public sector as weak and a drain on society. And that's where Centrelink started to get weak. People became dole bludgers and so on. This has infiltrated our social architecture, damaging our society, particularly our health and welfare services such as childcare, aged care and prisons, where profits have dominated. Rising inequalities damage society and political systems. 1 in 6 Australian children live in poverty, OECD definition, with the sharpest rise occurring during the so-called economic boom from 2003 to 2008. So much for the trickle-down economics. Our richest 1% owned more wealth than the bottom 70% of Australians combined, and 680 of our biggest corporations pay not 1 cent in tax. Not surprisingly, trust in our political and social mores was falling, with almost 3/4 of Australians suspicious, quote, that people in government only look after themselves, and over half viewed government as, quote, run just for the big interests. We performed poorly compared with other countries on non-economic metrics, and this is pretty scary stuff. In 2019, Australia was ranked 5th last out of 36 OECD countries on the Sustainable Development Goals, a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all, with only Israel, Greece, Turkey and Mexico behind us. I find that extraordinary. Corporate lobbyists, aided by the shock jocks and News Corp, became all-powerful and much more successful, influencing government decisions than evidence, data and science. It seemed that many politicians and corporate leaders regarded science as an annoyance that they could ignore or even denigrate. Money bought access to senior advisors and politicians, with over half of political donations coming from 5% of donors. Against this backdrop, it is hardly surprising that only 41% of Australians reported satisfaction with the way our democracy works. Socially, we're also fractured and becoming a more individualistic society. I'll just go through this quickly. It's just about people being more lonely, people not trusting their neighbours because they didn't know them, lots of time commuting to work, reducing family time, workplaces becoming two-tiered in society, and those in the gig economy working without benefits such as sick leave and parental leave. And so this had major implications on our health and welfare. Compared to those in the highest socioeconomic group, those in the lowest group had double the chance of dying of a potentially avoidable cause, 3 times more likely to smoke, and 2.5 times more likely that they couldn't see a dental professional or fill a prescription. And there's, as Ian Hickey quote, "We're in the grip of a mental health crisis where our dysfunctional public mental health system saw patients cycle in and out of emergency rooms." There's a phenomenon called modernity's paradox, which we wrote about some time ago, where despite a country's increasing prosperity, poor health outcomes and social gradients increase. So in spite of our world-class universal healthcare system, our most vulnerable were falling through the cracks. And as quoted by Darcy Holman, it's going to be the first time in history when our children are more likely to have shorter lives than we are, than their parents. So economic growth and profits came before our health and well-being. Oh, sorry, I've just gone to that. Right, sorry. Done that one, right. Yes, economic growth and profits came before our health and well-being. For example, in the midst of our obesity crisis, and I've just had a personal experience with this with the health minister, which I can't go into, but I'm just so shocked about it. 1 in 4 children, 1 in 3 adults being overweight and obese, junk food advertising to children thrived, and our leaders refused to consider a sugar tax, despite 2 decades of obesity research illustrating the role of diet in the obesity pandemic and the fact that it was estimated cost Australia $11.8 billion each year. Our leaders ignored the science. In climate action, people, particularly children, were testing, watching their future world being sacrificed for short-term financial gains. And the latest report made dire predictions of the ICCP, made dire predictions about what lay ahead if we ignored the science, which our leaders continued to do, pushing ahead with the Adani coal mine and subsidising the fossil fuel industry to the tune of an estimated $29 billion a year, or on a per capita basis, $1,198 per person, which goes into the fossil fuel industry. So the free market, which was supposed to solve all our problems, has resulted instead in us becoming a rather uncivil society. And it hardly paints a picture of one that we want to snap back to. So what happened during the pandemic? We saw our leaders prioritise health over the economy. Governments not only listened to scientists, but acted on evidence, used data and valued us. So everyone knows how to spell epidemiologists now, and they know what we do. As a consequence, we flattened the curve and are now in a position where a coronavirus is likely to be largely suppressed and outbreaks manageable. In Australia, this is. The rapid embracing of science reversed almost 20 years of ignoring calls to avoid the health effects of climate change, tackle obesity and substance abuse, prevent mental health problems, and to reduce the gap. Scientists were no longer denigrated, but praised. At the same time, our health professionals, teachers, and childcare workers were valued for their essential services. Similarly, Australia's trust in government and public services increased dramatically. Profits, lobbies, and partisan politics were cast aside. Human lives and societal well-being were paramount. This led to the most fundamental changes in our social fabric that we have ever witnessed, including free childcare, a fair basic income for those looking for work, doubling job seeker, and to retain employees during the height of the pandemic, JobKeeper. This socialist agenda was implemented almost overnight. There were lots of changes in families, and I'll just go through this quickly. Pace of life slowing, retreated to neighbourhoods, and this forged new connections and relationships. People began to know who their neighbours were, and rainbows and teddies became children's acts of support for each other to conquer the isolation of the virus, and chalk on the footpath became a daily occurrence. Commuting time was a thing of the past, breakfast with families occurred, and dads now at home realising that how big and enjoyable the task of child rearing is. And so these were acts of compassion and kindness, and what can be achieved when our leaders listen to the science during the pandemic also, however, exposed the inequities in our society and the weakness of our systems. So in sort of the homeschooling and the telehealth and the working from home has had both positive and negative effects, but of course, on the most vulnerable, particularly our children and young people, there were lots of issues. And I think you've seen probably the latest things on the ABC about some of the schools not being able to participate, and some kids are going to fall behind. I want to just say also about the health industry again, who exploited the pandemic for their financial gain. The College of Pathologists recommended against a cheaper coronavirus testing kit, which could be administered by anyone. And that meant that pathology clinics were raking in not just the $100 from Medicare, but another $200 for every test they ran. And that meant $124 million going into, of taxpayers' money, going into the hand of private pathology services. And to quote Stephen Duckett, it's because the powerful oligarchy acts in its own financial interests, protecting their own turf. Does not reflect well on the pathology corp companies. So there are worrying signs as our leaders begin to plan the restrictions that are going to ease, that the economy might be prioritised ahead of our health and well-being, and profits of a select few will determine our recovery path. For example, the hand-picked group by the Prime Minister to join the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission have strong links to the fossil fuel industry, particularly gas. Unsurprisingly, the main focus to date on the recovery plans has focused on Angus Taylor's gas-fired recovery. Where are our scientists and evidence informing the recovery? As a leading economist, Richard Dennis, points out, quote, capital-intensive mining and construction projects create far fewer jobs per billion dollars spent than investing in health and community services. Well, this begs several questions of what's going to drive our national recovery. Where is the consideration of our civil values and our younger citizens and future generations? Will our scientists, community leaders, health experts, and the evidence help forge our path to societal recovery? Or will those who make the biggest political donations determine the future of our nation's direction and short-sightedly see us focus on the economy alone? Surely, if the recent bushfires and pandemic have taught us anything, it is that we cannot continue pretending that our economy exists in a separate sphere, divorced from society and nature. So, after coronavirus, I think there are some wonderful things being written about this now. There is an urgency as we move to post-pandemic to improve our society, particularly how we might reverse its wicked problems. One of the most dangerous things would be to believe that everything was fine before the pandemic and that all we need to do is return to BC unchanged. Ordinary life then was already catastrophic. And this is Solnick talking again, quote, in terms of desperation and exclusion for too many human beings within wealthy nations like Australia and between countries, an environmental and climate catastrophe, an obscenity of inequality. She writes well. We might think that we have lost much during this pandemic, but we also consider what we might have to gain. Another danger to which we must be alert, good word, we need more alerts, is that bad people with power will try to make selfish gains from the situation, ram through policies that are damaging to our society or environment, while we're still too overwhelmed to notice. This is happening here in Australia as well as in the US. In Australia, we should not trust that the bipartisan and evidence-based decision-making about COVID-19 will flow over seamlessly into new and more humane way of government. How can we make this happen? How can we trust governments to make wise decisions for all of us? From the perspective of health and welfare services, particularly for children and youth, I have a wish list. We support the economist from Macquarie Bank, I have to get this reference, who suggests that we move away from market and capitalist solutions to a modified communist model. Their words. We would be best served by moving to more evidence and science-based decisions for services, away from vested interests and ideology. Following the successful socialisation of major health and welfare services during the pandemic, we urge government to reclaim these, not just federal, state and territory governments, but increasing local government control as well. I believe that local government has a fantastic role to play, closer to the people and responding to their needs. I strongly believe that essential services cannot be run for profit. We want to move from the business models of health and welfare services and towards people-centred care. Whilst unpopular with the medical profession, consideration should be given to eliminating fee-for-service for all health professionals and instead remunerating them well for the job they do. Nurses, teachers and welfare workers should be remunerated well, their value having been proved during this pandemic. A universal basic income should be introduced as a major way to improve the pathways into poor health and well-being associated with poverty. And I think that would be amazing. And I think it would be terrific if that could continue. I also think that models of citizen engagement, including young people, should be tested to decide on what should be prioritised for funding. The Oregon experiment some years ago demonstrated how wisely informed citizens can decide on health priorities. Many countries are engaging in various models of engaging citizens to guide their budgets based on well-being rather than GDP as a singular measure. And we're working on this in Australia, our Australian National Development Index. And the recommendation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart for an Aboriginal voice enshrined in the Constitution must be seriously considered and implemented. This singular act could improve the value and quality of First Nations services immediately. And I should say they've done amazingly well in terms of controlling the pandemic. We need another whole session on this because the Aboriginal controlled medical services have meant that we've only had about 55 cases, Aboriginal cases nationwide, none in remote communities and all in major urban centres. And I just want to finish with a quote from Peter Baker, who's a long writer for The Guardian, and then we can take questions. Hope I haven't gone on for too long. Quote, although COVID-19 is likely the biggest global crisis since World War II, it is still dwarfed by in the long term by climate change. Yet the two problems have suggested similarities. Both will require unusual levels of global cooperation. Both demand changes in behaviour today in the name of reducing suffering tomorrow. Both were long predicted with great certainty by scientists and have been neglected by governments. Not Australia in the case of COVID, of course, but internationally, and climate change. Unable to see beyond the next fiscal quarter's growth statistics, GDP being singularly influential. Accordingly, both will require governments to take drastic action and banish the logic of the marketplace from certain realms of human activity while simultaneously embracing public investment. So that's sort of my message too, but I wish in a way we hadn't called it climate change, because all of the factors which are causing climate change have also caused this pandemic. Environmental degradation and the closeness of people to things like wet markets and bats and all of these things. So, you know, we should be looking at the way we have lived as being instrumental in both the pandemic, climate change, environmental degradation, and all of these other wicked problems we're seeing. And I've been thinking about this for a long period of time now. But anyway, thank you very much for being guinea pigs for my essay and Kate Lysett's essay. And I'd love to have some feedback and some questions. I hope I haven't gone on too long, Peter.
No, you've done very well. And I must admit that I haven't seen any questions coming forward on the chat, but I'm sure there are quite a few that people have. Can I just start? There's some amazing statements you've made there, and I'd really like to have a good discussion about the universal basic income as a base for a new social contract that we're going to need. There's been a lot of discussion in our media this morning on 6WF. There was a very interesting discussion. Lots of people coming in with ideas, basically saying, okay, everyone's going to be poorer. How do we manage that? We cannot make a more unfair society. We have to have jobs. So we need a new social contract about how to do that. And someone did mention the universal basic income, but perhaps it's not that well understood. Maybe you could just outline how that works and some of the literature that's now being put forward on the few experiments that have been done on that. Do you know enough about that to answer?
No, I'm not across it as much as others, but Janet McCalman, who's co-editing this book that we're doing the essay for, she's a historian, but she actually works in global and population health at UniMelb. She said that after World War II, they basically had a commitment to full employment. And I mean, so many things happened after catastrophes like World War II. I mean, the NHS was implemented, the universal basic income. I can remember we were discussing this when I was doing my social medicine course, my epidemiology course in the UK in the 1970s. And of course, what they called it then, what they were calling it then was a livable income, an income that was actually enabled you to live. And I think that the way that particularly this most recent government has treated the unemployment benefits, and it's become a punitive system rather than in Scandinavia, where in fact unemployment benefits or universal basic income, what you'd like to call it, actually is a very positive thing which enables you to get on and retrain. And I think there are lots that we can learn from the Scandinavian countries about this. But I think that we need to, and Janet is very, very keen on us looking at a universal basic income, which seems to me would replace the unemployment benefits. The argument that people have against it is that people would not work. They wouldn't actually do any work. But the point is that people on the whole do, and do very creative things on a universal basic income. So I don't know too much about it, Peter, but I do think it's something very seriously that should be looked at, because it could in fact address the issues of poverty that we see in this country, which are unacceptable for a country like Australia. In Norway, for example, a CEO of a company can't earn more than 10 times the people in his company. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Wonder what it's over 100, I think, for many of ours.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. The universal basic income is something that enables people to work, but do things like volunteering, growing food in community gardens, helping people with disabilities, and enabling them to give back as well as receive enough to have a basic income. It is more than,
and to be a parent, one should say.
And to be a parent, yeah. It takes away a lot of the present welfare system. You don't need to, it's just automatically given.
That's right. So that's the point.
You save a lot of bureaucracy and pain in that bureaucracy.
And the robo Centrelink disaster as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we have been very punitive to our poor people.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at, I think Vicky Laurie did a very good article on this for an Aboriginal mum with a single mum with 2 kids who was trying to get access to some services and had to go through it. And it was extraordinarily difficult for this poor woman to get through this. And so, you know, in the end, people give up.
Yeah.
Whereas if we had universal basic income, that mother would get it. She would be able to look after her kids, provide shelter, provide housing, provide education, provide food.
Yeah. Okay. There's a few questions now. The first one was from someone who came in quite late and said, will Fiona's essay be available anywhere? And certainly it is coming out in a book in writing, but we have recorded this and it will be available to people, and we will be able to circulate anyone who came to this with that, and because it's a pretty powerful message that Fiona's given, and I think it's important to see it as well as read it. And Sylvia has raised a question. Sylvia is a chaplain in one of the hospitals, and is a Dutch theologian who's come to live in Fremantle and joined our community. And she says, can you please elaborate a bit more on the long-term negative effects for children of the pandemic? Does Professor Stanley see a role for spiritual and pastoral care for the sustainability of healthcare in Australia? 2 easy questions there.
No, they're fantastic questions, actually. And I think that the pandemic has actually has the potential to have an extraordinary negative effect on children and young people. And there's been articles on this in the Saturday paper and others. I mean, it's come again and again that that they were not doing that well before the pandemic, and the pandemic has, because young people on the whole were in casual employment, many of them in the creative industries, all of these things, and there's been a result already of increased anxiety and depression coming through with the helplines and so on, the lifelines, and they're going to be the ones that are going to take longer to bounce back, because we don't know what's going to happen to many of the places that employed them. And also there's been a huge inequitable ability to manage with homeschooling. And so the kids who are in wealthy families have done very well, and the kids who are not have not done so well. So how are they going to cope? What's going to happen with this year? Would almost be a year of them going through this this dramatically negative time.
Yeah.
And I think that what's lacking in our society, and I think this is where, Sylvia, you'll I hope be able to make some lead. And you could see in my little diagram that I had spiritual in the side, and as one of the most important aspects of our society, with economic and social and spiritual and the workplace and so on. And so how do we get that into the children who need it most? And of course, one big group of children who need it are the ones who are going to get it from their Aboriginal culture. And that's what's so exciting about that, is the commitment by the elders and Aboriginal controlled services to bring that back to the children that they see. But they are depleted. And Christabel Shamrat, who's part of this today, hello Christabel, is doing this kind of work up in places like Balgo and Fitzroy Crossing, and showing that when you have a cultural and spiritual depth and strength, there is absolutely a huge impact on children's self-esteem and their mental health and their ability to cope with the system, the dominant culture. So I think there is a huge role for a spiritual support for our children and young people, but you're up against an extremely difficult and harsh and scary social media, the dominant media that's full of the most fake news and things that children are tapping into. And so it's really important, I think, for parents to realise how valuable that spiritual environment is for their children, and to pay attention to that. So I think it's a fantastic question. I'd just love to have more talk with you about how we might do it. Chaplains in schools would be...
There's an invitation for you, Sylvia, and definitely we should organise a meeting so that that conversation can happen. You probably live 100 metres apart. There are quite a few questions now. Rosemary Spark would like to ask about the homeless, and we've had an experience in this event of putting homeless people in very good accommodation in hotels and so on. Some of them, we have an outreach that works with quite a bit of homeless people through our whatever it's called, the In Giving We Receive. No, that's the Nepalese thing, the other one. There have been some people change their lives in that experience by having a fairly cared for environment to live in for a while. Do you think we can do better about this?
Of course, and I think again, looking at some of the other countries like Holland and again the Scandinavian countries, I'm very keen on Scandinavia and how its social democratic governments have been working well for populations. And I think you have to look at the pathways into homelessness too, mental health problems. When we closed all the institutions for mentally ill people, and when you look at things like fetal alcohol now taking such a big role in disabilities and so on, that those pathways, we've neglected how we care for people who often end up homeless. And I think that, but what an incredible opportunity the pandemic has offered, with examples from all over the world about how they've dealt with homeless people. And as one woman said on the radio the other day, well, if you can do it during a pandemic, why can't you do it all the time? And that's come out not just for the homeless situation, which I think has been amazing, but also the universal basic income. You know, why can't you do it all the time? But you know, and I think the other, I want to give a lot of credit to the Aboriginal services here, the Aboriginal Controlled Services, and what they've done with their elders and their people who are living on the streets. I mean, it's been extraordinary how they've provided for them in terms of accommodation, but also all the needs that they have. So I think, yes, I think we can learn so much. It'd be just great if we could actually think about how we have handled this during the pandemic, and why can't we do it all the time? It seems obvious, it seems interesting, doesn't it, that we've got a different view of the economic issues now. You can make money, can't you? You can just create money, can't you, and spend it. Maybe that's what we should be thinking about. What budgets really are about is helping people, not you know, keeping it in the black.
Yeah, Ross Garno's been speaking about this quite a bit, and the last 10 years, which he calls the dog days, they've been trying desperately to print more money to get things going again, and it hasn't worked, basically.
No.
So we were heading towards a collapse. The COVID actually didn't cause the collapse, it facilitated it, and that renewing process has to be something that is renewed through the economy in a new way, because it wasn't working.
I think there's some very good quotes from economists and others about what was already happening. As you said, it hasn't already. I'll just give you a quote here from Al Jazeera, Paul Mason's article in Al Jazeera, saying, left-wing economists warned that in the long term, stagnant growth and high debt were likely to lead to three policies: states paying citizens a universal income, central bank lending to state to keep it afloat, and large-scale public ownership of major corporations to maintain vital services that cannot be run for profit. So this is exactly what happened with the pandemic. All these have now been rapidly implemented. We do not know what an industrial capitalism without carbon would look like, because all our institutions, practices and cultures are based around fossil fuel extraction. Likewise, globalization without 1 billion living in slums, without deforestation, live animal markets and widespread diseases of poverty in the third world. These are fundamental features of existing capitalism. Isn't that a great quote?
Yeah.
That was Paul Mason in Al Jazeera. That was called Post-COVID Capitalism.
Yeah, well, that's a good title, Post-COVID Capitalism, and it's certainly a different capitalism. Yoli is saying that what could it look like, this new capitalism? Because socialism didn't work in many places, and there are lots of pros and cons for it. How do you imagine this new kind of socialism? And someone else said, John Daniel said, well, what is a modified communist model? How would it work?
Yeah, well, isn't it interesting? The Macquarie Bank economist actually mentioned that word, you know, sort of like a modified communism. But I don't think socialism's had a real go anywhere, except perhaps Cuba, and there are lots of problems in Cuba too, I know. But I mean, Cuba's a very good example of how socialism is really working, and as in Kerala in India. So I think there are some examples, whether we can scale it up, but we have a huge job to try and reverse this greedy capitalist agenda with big corporates and the Rupert Murdoch media. I know we've got rid of Alan Jones, but there are other shock jocks who are going to come up and take his place. You know, that is pervasive. Look at Trump and what he's doing in the States is unbelievably. I mean, he's causing as many deaths. He's causing lots of deaths in America because of his stupidity. But I mean, his is a extreme capitalism, and so I think it's going to be a huge challenge for us to turn that juggernaut around. I really do. But we just have to try and do it. That's why I'm involved in this Beyond GDP project and seeing if we can't get, you know, governments to see that the GDP as a singular measure is very flawed and doesn't help our society.
Two others have commented on the universal basic income.
Yeah.
Bill has said, let's stop people rushing back to their previously destructive jobs. This is one thing UBI could do. And Peters has said that the Rutger Bergman's Utopia for Realists is about the universal basic income and how it was employed in a great experiment. It's a great book.
His comments at Davos probably went down like a lead balloon when he accused all of them of arriving in their jets and not sort of understanding how the equity would serve a better agenda for the world. I think that was very interesting indeed.
But he did get a chance to talk about it. It is on the agenda anyway, and maybe this is the chance to get it further up.
Yeah,
certainly we've been invited to think about a new social contract. The Prime Minister's speech yesterday and the kind of work that Christian Porter is now trying to establish, where people are talking about a new social contract. How can we create better jobs, because jobs are going to dominate the agenda, and at the same time enable the society to function? So it is a new world.
What we have to do is we have to support Sally McManus. She's got an amazing responsibility on that particular committee, and anything we can do to support Sally McManus I think, you know, it's an incredible opportunity. Incredible.
Yes, she's a very perceptive person who needs support. So just on the politics of it all, Richard, who's coordinating this event for us in the background, he's saying, well, we did see scientists having a big role in the COVID campaign. They were looked at. We did see the curves which were flattened. We know they need to apply to other curves that are out of control, like in climate change. How do you think it affected the standing of science in the eyes of politicians?
Well, I like to think that I'm hoping that it will affect their relationship with all scientists. But when I'm in my deepest, darkest hours, I think, well, they took notice of the pandemic scientists, but they still don't value those who are looking at things like climate change and environmental degradation and, agricultural practices and so on. You know, the marvelous guy who's been talking about, Lyndon Meyer, talking about burning. I mean, those are as important as these epidemiologists of the moment, actually. And it's about, you know, it's about balance. It's about making sure that the kind of science that's going to impact upon not just the climate scientists, but the social and behavioural aspects of how we need to change, to really point out to people that, you know, doctors shouldn't be screwing the system the way they are, and that, you know, we don't need so much medical research in sort of with the gene jockeys and all of those things. We need it as much in the social determinants of health and the social determinants of education, and the reason why these sort of equitable societies work so much better for the health and well-being of everybody, and how, you know, services set up for profit fail. So it's getting that sort of balance of getting all that science on board, and I don't think we do that well. And I'm hoping that because the science has been so successful in the pandemic, that it will transfer to a post-pandemic era, and that science again, and it's up to the people to sort of say, we want you to value science. So I'd love to have a little bit of a discussion, if there's any questions, about how we get citizens' viewpoints more into government. Now, they had a review of the public service, which you may remember, Glyn Davis was on it, and it was headed by, and one of the things that they were very keen on is ways to engage the public. And I think we've had so many good examples. We have, you know, the Oregon experiment, we have citizens' juries, we have consent statements, which I'd love to have more of, where we've had all of this in the Institute for years. We've had citizens informing us about how we should do our research, how we should approach the public, what research we should do, how we should translate it. There's just so much that we could do where we could say to citizens, what do you value? What is it you want to make a better society for us? And that's part of the project we're doing, this project, the Beyond GDP project. And the OECD is very keen to support countries who, Jacinda Ardern is doing it in New Zealand. Canada's done the Wellbeing Index. We've got Wales, what kind of Wales you want, where citizens' engagement is very important in terms of deciding what the public, deciding what's good for the bureaucracy to concentrate on.
Very helpful. We covered a lot then. I want to get back to the doctors who you mercilessly attacked there at one point.
Yes.
I'd never heard anything about this cheap COVID test that could have been available free and easily, and yet the pathologist won by having $200 a test. Tell us.
Well, it was brought to my notice by the Grattan Institute and Stephen Duckett's review of it, and I was shocked. I mean, I've always thought that pathology testing was over the top. I hadn't realised the extent to which there were just a very small number of private companies running pathology services for the nation, and really they make a huge amount of money, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. But you know, when you go and have a blood test, you don't need to have the 55 tests that they run. I mean, if you're anemic, all you need really is your hemoglobin done and your red cell count, and perhaps some iron. But you know, they run about 25 different tests, which most of which are normal. And so there's a huge over-investigation of people, which doesn't always benefit you. And then there's an over-investigation and over with scanning and x-rays. I was talking to a young neuroradiologist from Sydney who said, my colleagues have said they won't go on call unless they're going to earn $1 million a year from the hospital.
Well, yeah.
It's not, anyway, I just feel it's wrong to exploit people's health and ill health to make money. And a lot of these are now money-making concerns. Look, there are some wonderful doctors, wonderful GPs. There are fabulous people out there, as you know. But once you've got a fee for service, it's not fraud, but there's a tendency to charge. I'll do that because I can. You know, so the cesarean sections, which we've researched amazingly, which showed that the rising rates of cesarean section were all in women having their first baby with absolutely no medical risks at all. And once you've had one cesarean section, you're much more likely to have a second one in the next pregnancy. They didn't have any indications, except probably social, for that cesarean section. Now, it's not a benefit to the mother or the child to have a cesarean section.
No.
It's major abdominal surgery. Anyway, I could go on about this for a long time, but we need to look at a health system which isn't actually a universal healthcare system that serves the people. And I know there are problems with the NHS, but we have to look at what might be a better system to serve the population better.
Yeah, well, it's there's a lot there, and perhaps the social contract has to start with unions like the Australian Medical Association, who don't necessarily represent the whole of the medical and health system. So, yeah, look, that's it opens so many big questions, but we can't keep going with that highly expensive system that's now getting out of control.
It's true, and I think you know, there are quite there are quite a lot of things which are done by doctors which don't have the evidence of effectiveness, and some of them are actually really damaging. And that 7:30 report on back pain,
Yeah.
you know, you just wonder. And then there's the sort of the vaginal mesh story. There's lots and lots of stories of where medical care has been damaging to the population. And the thing that's really worrying me is that when you've got something like a fee for service, I mean, nurses aren't on a fee for service, and everyone, so with just a good income, much higher, of course, it will be than the universal basic income, Peter, and hopefully that doctors would be satisfied with that. But of course, they won't be.
No, it's there's a bit of greed around, that's for sure. So we're clearly raising quite deep issues here, and they are quite spiritual in the end.
They are very spiritual, and I think it's about caring for your fellow man and caring for your fellow person. And of course, I care particularly for children and young people. And you know, what makes me feel so positive is when I mentor these young people and speak with them. They're just fantastic. They've got a future which is much more equitable and much more caring. And we've got to build on that. We've really got to build on that.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about that Indigenous experience with the managing of COVID and how they did it? And
yes, well, I think we're going to do a whole nother piece on this, actually. The Australia Institute want us to do a webinar on it, and I've refused to do it without all of the Aboriginal leaders who've actually made the big difference. So Sandra Eads and Adrian Carson from Southeast Queensland, Mark Wenatong from North Queensland, Dan McCauley from Edith Cowan, and Leslie Nelson from SWAMS, and people from Derbyl Yerrigan. I mean, they could all come on and give a fantastic webinar about what they did. But what was interesting, Peter, is that the people know from the swine flu epidemic that Aboriginal people are much higher risk. They got the disease more, they got it more severely, they were hospitalised more, and they died more. And so but as soon as those reports came in from China, particularly people in Queensland and Western Australia started thinking already about what it would mean for the Aboriginal population if they got infected, because of the way they live, which is, you know, culturally several generations living together. That's the way people live. They're often poor. They've often got respiratory illness. They've got diabetes and other things. So they had chronic disease. And so they lobbied the federal government, Nacho lobbied the federal government, and they closed all of the remote communities. They haven't had one case of COVID-19 in a remote community. I mean, this is unbelievable.
yeah.
And so the Aboriginal controlled medical services increased their staff, got out amazing PR stuff. If you want to have some good videos about COVID-19, go to the Nacho website or go to the websites here and see what they've told their people. They've gone and helped their homeless, I mentioned that. But all of the Aboriginal medical services are now able to have facilities for prevention, management, and getting, when people get sick, to manage them. And it has been an extraordinary success. And I think this needs to be shouted from the rooftops because, of course, Aboriginal people are no good at doing anything, are they? They can't work themselves. Well, come on. This is the best example of why we need to give them a voice. Because, boy, they have... Look at every other country with a colonised Indigenous population during the pandemic, and those communities have done really badly. And Australia, our Aboriginal communities have really succeeded. They're a role model.
Wonderful
so
story.
We need to read that up.
Oh, we should see that on 7:30 report or something. It's
absolutely. Actually, I should recommend it to them, and also on the Drum and places like that. Absolutely, that's a very good suggestion, Peter.
It's a great story and one that we need to hear to see how we can proceed with that one, because if we can't sort that one out, then, you know, we haven't even begun the social contract.
Well, I think, you know, we need to give them a voice enshrined in the Constitution. We need to start the treaty negotiations, and we need to have the history telling. That's the Uluru Statement. I mean, it's fantastic. The other thing is that I think instead of, you know, comparing Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people to determine the gap, I think that's useless. I think we should look at within Aboriginal populations, who's doing well and who's not doing well. Forget the non-Aboriginal population. We haven't had a stolen generation. We haven't been marginalised. We haven't been damaged. But there are people within the Aboriginal community who are very diverse, and it'd be much, much more helpful if we want to close the gap to actually look at who's doing well and who isn't doing well and why. So that would be much better, and that would be something we could do post-COVID as well.
Well,
sorry, lots of things out.
Yeah. Look, we're past 5 o'clock here. That's past 7 o'clock at your time, and we've had a good discussion. We have got this recorded, and we would like to share it. We'll have an edit of it. If you want anything taken out, you can. But it's important for us to share some of these messages. I don't know.
And what about all the chat questions and stuff, which I've only just opened now?
Yeah.
And they look really helpful and interesting. So can I get a
copy? We can certainly keep all them. They'll be there. And
okay.
I think I've asked you most of them. But
I mean, the other thing that we haven't sort of started on is the inequitable salaries within the university system, but we won't go there. And why vice-chancellors lead $1 million and yet the rest of the staff might have to be sacked. That I don't even want to start there, but that's another example of this greed that really is not serving our tertiary education system well at all. And I think, you know, the University of Sydney's Vice-Chancellor is earning $1.5 million, and yet some of his staff are going to have to take redundancies. I mean, you can do a lot with $1.5 million in a university. We work for, you know, for much. We could serve lots of research and teaching with that kind of money. Anyway, but that's another thing that it just is an example of these, you know, this post-Thatcher Reagan greed that's infiltrated so many of our institutions, and it's just not the way to go. And
we can't snap back to it. So
exactly.
And I think that bouncing forward is going to require some fairly fundamental things. Now, we will keep having these discussions. We've got, I'd like to keep this slot of Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and I will try to get a team of people who will be able to help us on this. And if you hear of others who you think can contribute to it, we do want to have this discussion continuing.
Great.
But it's going to be very hard to get anyone quite as perceptive and as courageous as you. Fiona, it's been a privilege to hear, and
I don't depend on government anymore, so I can criticise them for as much as I like.
Yeah.
It's good being old, isn't it? It's good being old.
It is. So yeah, let's keep going. And for everybody around here, around the table, it's very hard to get a round of applause, but at least put on the chat a few thumbs up. And
thank you very much.
Richard, why don't you open up for everyone so that we can all see each other? And if there's anyone else who has
apologising to me because he said, "Oh, I only sing sea shanties."
Yeah, this is what happens when everything opens up. I'll probably let you all.
They're a form of music the same as anything else.
Sea shanty.
Yeah, so you know the old.
Like as in.
All right, so that's everyone. You can see them there. And we're all.